Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first Bring Your Own Sandwiches remote lunchtime webinar brought to you by the 4-Day Week Global and FinTech NZ. And the topic for today is productivity in New Zealand post-Covid-19. Now, clearly, if New Zealand is going to come out of the pandemic stronger and better, we have to find ways to do things in a more innovative fashion. But critical to that is improving the productivity of New Zealand. And so what we've tried to do today is bring together experts from all aspects of the economy to talk about how we do that, what are the challenges we face, and what are the opportunities that might exist for the future. And so I'm now going to hand you over to James Brown, FinTech NZ, who's going to moderate the session.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome to everybody. And for those that don't know me, my name is James Brown and I'm the General Manager for FinTech NZ. No relation, just in case you were wondering. And as Andrew's mentioned, today's session is brought to you by Perpetual Guardian and FinTech NZ. Most of you may have seen some of the recent media and the discussions around how 4-day week can actually impact a business. So personally, I actually am really looking forward to today's discussion. My apologies. We have a very distinguished panel, both from industry and academia. And what I'd like to do now is just actually introduce them in the order in which we'll go through. But before we do that, a little bit of housekeeping. Because we are at an event and we've got rather large numbers, in the event of an incident, please do the usual drop, duck, cover and hold. You should, in theory, know where the bathrooms are if you're at your own house. I would hope that you do. If you don't, then we could have a problem. Please put your hand up. And if you brought your own sandwiches, please feel free to enjoy them as we go through the session. So first up, what I'd like to do is introduce you to Murray Sherwin, who's the chair of the New Zealand Productivity Commission, and he's been in the role for just over 9 years. An economist with over 35 years experience in a wide range of public policy roles, Murray's previous appointments include Chief Executive and Director General of the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, the member of the Board of Executive Directors of the World Bank, and a member of the Prime Minister's Advisory Group. There was a little bit more, but the list is very long and very distinguished. Next up will be Phil O'Reilly, and he's the Managing Director for IronDuke Partners, and he's a New Zealand global business leader and advocate, and through his extensive network is deeply engaged in public policy and business issues, both locally and globally. And today we'll be talking about putting business in the lead by building productivity. And after Phil, we'll have Anna. And Anna Curson is the Chief Products Officer at accounting software giant Xero and was a finalist in the Women of the Influence Awards. Now, before Xero, Anna worked as senior roles at both ASB and Digital First at Spark, and she's recognised as an influencer in the tech sector. And she'll be talking about New Zealand's productivity conundrum. Then we will hear from Dr. Jarrod Haar, who's the Professor of Human Resources at the Auckland University of Technology. He's a PhD in Organisational Behaviour, Human Resource Management from the University of Waikato, and he conducted the quantitative research on the 4-day week for Perpetual Guardian. And he currently consults for a number of companies looking to adopt the programme. And he'll be talking about the productivity or distracted employee evidence of working from home over the COVID-19 lockdown. Then we'll have Charlotte Lockhart, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the 4-day week Global Project. She's a business leader with more than 25 years experience in multiple industries, locally and offshore. And as the CEO of the 4-day week Global Campaign, she's working hard to promote internationally the benefits of working focused, the reduced hour in the workplace. And Charlotte will be talking about less is more, the 4-day week solution to the productivity gap. And last but not least, we'll have Aaron Poladzic, is the National Secretary of the New Zealand Public Services Association, the PSA, which is New Zealand's largest union, representing more than 70,000 workers, of which, an amazing statistic, 70% are women. And Aaron brings a wealth of advocacy to the industry, and I'll be talking about the most effective vehicle for positive societal change and social justice. So, how's it going to work? So now we've met the panelists, they'll all present for about 6 minutes. And if we can then ask up to about 3 questions before we move on to the next panelists. Once everyone has spoken, we'll open up the floor to the Q&A, and we'll try and get through as many of your questions as we possibly can. Now, there is the chat function, but we would like you, if you could, to use the Q&A button so that we can actually collate all the questions. And if we can't get through all your questions, we'll endeavour to answer them post this session. So look, strap in, let's look forward to it. It's going to be amazing. And Murray, what I'd like to do now is hand over to you to get us started.
Well, thank you, James. Pleasure to be here and to participate in this. I'm going to be talking about productivity. What is it? Why it matters, maybe even more so in post-COVID world. A bit about New Zealand's past performance and some priorities ahead. Productivity is essentially about how we turn inputs, it's labour, capital, raw materials, intellectual property and so on, into outputs. It's the goods and services for sale. And our living standards, which we can think about in different ways, income, well-being, however you like to measure that, or the quality and range of options and choices available to us, they all are products of productivity. They all derive from that. And today we're engaging in this webinar from our homes or our offices, scattered maybe around the country, maybe around the world, linked by this incredible technology, which wasn't available even a matter of a few years ago. And what separates us today in this activity from the life of the hunter-gatherers of 10,000 years ago is essentially productivity. We've developed very high skills. We've become deeply specialized in our work. We work with sophisticated technology. We sell our output of goods and services, perhaps globally. And unlike our hunter-gatherer forebears, we're also deeply dependent on others to supply our basic needs, food, clothes, housing, whatever. At the firm level, productivity improvements are mostly derived from the introduction of new technologies, or by combining technologies in new ways or new processes, smarter design, smarter distribution, smarter sales capacities, better management, governance, and of course, in relations with employees and how that works. At the macro or economy-wide level, productivity certainly keys off those firm-level issues, but there's another dynamic that economists pay a lot of attention to, and that's the reallocation of resources between firms, especially skills and capital. So failing firms close, release resources which in a well-functioning economy flow to higher productivity, higher growth firms, or higher productivity firms simply outcompete others for the best skills, make better calls on new investments, have better management, and that's where the income dividend arises. Reallocation of resources within an economy tends to be the biggest source of productivity growth. And there's a whole dynamic under this. Productivity is about change, it's about dynamics, and that's what drives the game. New Zealand has had a long slide in its productivity performance since the 1960s. There's a related slide in relative per capita incomes as well. We're not going backwards, we're just not going forwards as fast as others, particularly the other small advanced economies, which we typically benchmark ourselves against. That means we have lower living standards, more limited choices, both at the private household level and at the public government level. The gap now between our sort of comparators, if you like, is as much as 30% in GDP per hour worked. We've managed to compensate to some extent over the last decade or so. Our GDP growth rates have been pretty respectable, but we've done that by adding more inputs, especially labour. Our population growth has been amongst the fastest in the OECD. Labour force participation is very high here, and our unemployment rate has been falling and is pretty low. So we've supported household incomes by having more people working and by having each of them work more hours than in other countries. So we've been adding inputs, particularly labour, to produce more outputs. And that's not a pathway to improve productivity. We're growing, as the caption said, we're growing fatter rather than fitter. So productivity is about producing more from less, including producing higher incomes from fewer hours worked, hence the 4-day week exercise. So now we've got COVID. It's an enormous shock, probably the biggest since the Depression, and it's going to cause a lot of damage. I'm don't have to dwell on that, you all know that. Exporting our way out of it would be one way normally, but the rest of the world, if anything, is in worse shape than we are. So the productivity impact of COVID can only be negative. Higher unemployment, capital redundancy, ruptured business and staff relationships, low returns on capital, weaker sales, and so on. And we all know from past experience that those sorts of downturns have long-lasting effects. So what are the priorities? Well, getting business back to business, employees back to work safely, of course, it's got to be a priority. Governments can support incomes for a period through expansionary fiscal and monetary policies, but not for the long term. Well-being and higher living standards aren't derived from monetary and fiscal expansion. It's the production and sale of goods and services that matter. There's a role for the government, a key role for the government is to ensure that it's creating an environment in which businesses can thrive. Now, there's a long list of things we could run through here. I mean, I focus on the basics, monetary, fiscal policy, doing that well, regulatory, tax, social policy, all of that matters. Infrastructure is already out there. There's a big hole that can be filled, can create activity and provide jobs. Skills, I think, are particularly important at this stage. High productivity economies are those with high skills. The best of our graduates are as good as any, but we've got an enormously long tail of poor literacy and numeracy of our school leavers, our young people. That's very costly and is damaging socially and economically. There's a pile of environmental priorities, everything from water, soils, climate, and biodiversity. Higher incomes that depend on depleting our natural capital is just not a winning formula, and technology is the key to all of this. So this is a time for government to support firms and families through the trough, but we can't do this forever. Above all, it's a time for really a clear-eyed sense of where we want to go, matched by some really smart and hard-nosed prioritisation as we head for the New Zealand. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Murray. Excuse me. And just before we go to Phil, you mentioned there actually around labour, and labour obviously sort of doing a really good job pre-COVID in terms of propping up productivity. But do you think there's, maybe putting you on the spot here in terms of some numbers, but if we're looking at unemployment moving to doubling, and possibly there's been talk and sentiment around even tripling, do you have some figures in your mind on how much productivity actually may drop because of that?
Not specifically, no. We know that we're going to have unemployment high. We know that we're going to lose a lot of firms in this process, and we know that the international environment to export into is going to be difficult. We know that we could be 2 years at least away from having international tourism back to anything like its previous levels, and that's 10 to 12% of jobs, perhaps, in the tourism sector. So activity will certainly drop, and productivity, I think, has to drop. I don't have firm numbers in mind. I think there's a lot of work to be done to try to identify that, and how long all of this lasts makes a big difference.
And we've had a question come in, and this might actually be a question for everybody, but Murray, if you can maybe just put some light around it, if you may. Should we prioritise the sectors we focus on to help drive our productivity?
If only you knew which sectors to prioritise, and the ones that you think about probably aren't going to be the ones that come through. I mean, it's the new stuff that bubbles up. I think providing an environment in which firms can innovate and grow matters. Trying to choose which ones gets really tricky, and I mostly try to avoid that.
Yeah, I mean, again, maybe a question I think for later in the sort of the team Q&A. But if I think about technology as an example, where we've seen that as one of the fastest growing sectors pre-COVID. Obviously, we'll have to obviously consider that. Obviously, now we're in COVID at the moment. But thank you very much for your presentation, and obviously we'll have you engaged a little bit later on in the Q&A. But what I'd like to do now is hand over to Philip and obviously hear some of your views. Thank you, Philip.
Well, thanks, James, and thanks for the invitation to be with you. I apologise for being overdressed. I'm back at the office, so I have to wear a uniform. So one of those global things that I do, which you heard about during the introduction, is I chair a thing called Business at OECD, which is the business group that points at the OECD based in Paris. And the OECD, of course, is the think tank of the developed economies, and over the years it's done a lot of work on productivity. And so let me start with just a few of the challenges that New Zealand faces if you look at other countries, and some of the reasons why, to Murray's point, our productivity performance has been pretty poor compared to some of those other economies that we tend to compare ourselves with. So let's have a look at some of those issues. Firstly, the OECD will tell you that location matters. In other words, one of the reasons Denmark, for example, is pretty productive and pretty wealthy is it sits just 10 minutes away from Germany. And Germany, of course, has a massive manufacturing and a massive high-tech base. And Denmark can therefore be pretty productive just by supplying German autos, for example, or German manufacturing capability. We're not very close to anybody, and that's a challenge for us. Next point is the OECD will tell you that sectors matter. So pharmaceuticals and defence, for example, are two big sectors that drive productivity because they're very capital intensive, very R&D intensive, and they've got a lot of government spending in them. We have none of those sectors here in New Zealand. Our sectors that we've traditionally found are strong sectors for us in terms of employment and economic growth tend to be agriculture and more latterly tourism, neither of which are particularly productive worldwide. In fact, our agriculture sector is one of the more productive in the world, but still, if you compare it to, say, pharmaceuticals, not very productive at all. Third thing that the OECD will tell you is that frontier firms matter. In other words, this idea that some firms are highly productive, highly innovative, and they're world leaders, and they pay their staff enormously good sums of money, and they tend to drag other firms forward with them, or if they don't do that, they kill off old firms that are not particularly productive because of the competitive pressure that these frontier firms bring. An example of a frontier firm in New Zealand is Xero, and I know we're going to hear from Xero later on, but that's an example of a frontier firm. But the reason we all know Xero is because frontier firms in New Zealand are few and far between. We don't have that many, and therefore we don't have that necessarily that competitive tension. And also many of our markets aren't very competitive either, often dominated by 2 or 3 major players. And so you don't necessarily have that competition whereby the people who are struggling fall over quickly and you can reallocate capital somewhere else. Another driver of productivity is supply chains. And one of the most famous of those, I go back to Germany, is called the Mittelstand, the idea of small or medium-sized family-owned companies sitting in the supply chains of productivity behemoths like Mercedes or BMW in that economy. Those supply chains also don't really operate in New Zealand in the same way. So you're not seeing the big productivity gains that you might see from, say, the Mittelstand in Germany. And add all that up, of course, so add that up and you can understand why New Zealand has a particular productivity challenge. And there's a bunch of other stuff that's also gets in our way. So we need to think very clearly about productivity because, to Murray's point, we've tended to grow over the last 10 years. You can argue about how much by importing people. And we're not going to be doing that for the next couple of years, no matter what. So really, if we want to pull ourselves out of what we're going through and get ourselves wealthier and more prosperous and have all the well-being outcomes that we want in terms of health and welfare benefits, in order to pay for that, we really have no choice now but to think about how we gain productivity and think about that, pretty aggressively, frankly, which is why I was so happy to pick up this opportunity today. Let me now turn to just a few ideas. I've got 5 ideas here about themes that at a firm level, at a company level in New Zealand, we can think about in terms of trying to build productivity in our own firms. The first one is skills. Obviously, the higher skilled you are, the more well you're paid, the more efficient you're likely to be. And the New Zealand skills story is not all that good. We don't tend to be a highly skilled economy in the same way, for example, that Ireland might be, or Singapore, two of those advanced small economies, open economies that Murray was talking about. Now, government announcements in the budget, I think, were right about saying we want to make skills acquisition just as easy as we can. But I think the budget announcements were wrong-headed in the sense that they chose a couple of areas like agriculture and construction, and said we'll make those skills free to get, and you'll pay normally for other skills. Now, in all my experience of industry training, I've been doing industry training activities now for more than 30 years. I've never known a time whereby somebody makes a career choice based on free training, or at least free versus paid for training. The better idea, I think, is for us to have a policy over the next 2 years that says, if you've chosen a new job, we are going to co-invest as government alongside you and the employer in picking up some new skills to make sure that you can pick up and really build that job at pace. And I think there's a big role in the future over the next few years and beyond for micro skills, so micro credentialing, because the idea that we're all going to take an apprenticeship is kind of nice, but it's 3 years before we get the real cream out of that. The idea of micro credentialing, the idea of quick learning that sits on the framework, sits on the qualifications framework, I think is a really good way forward for us. So I think government had the right idea. I don't think they executed it very well in the budget. Next issue of the 5 is market scale. To Murray's point, productive firms tend to be exporting. The size of the economy of New Zealand is now significantly smaller than the size of the economy of Sydney, Australia. So in order to get any productivity out of what we're doing, just to say we're going to sell to New Zealanders isn't going to get us very far. In fact, we're likely to go backwards. So we need those export markets, and that's where things like FTAs become really important. That's why the Trans-Tasman bubble is so important. That's why I've been arguing over the last few weeks publicly that we should open our border, not because of passports, but because you are well. We still need skilled migrants. We're still going to need New Zealand business people traveling the world, selling goods and services and opening up new markets. So we need to think very clearly about issues of market scale when we think about this. And when we think about those outside markets being a bit unhealthy, as Murray talks about, they're also going through pretty hard times. So one of the great things about New Zealand is that we because we mainly sell food overseas, things like food and timber, we'll still be able to do that. During the global financial crisis, the evidence was that we were able to continue selling stuff pretty well. We just got a lesser price for it. And that's not good for us, but at least we're not selling televisions or motor cars where people simply won't buy them for a period of time as they go through a recession. So we've got some benefits there, but the answer then is to build some technology and some value around those products, and that's really hard at times of a recession. Next theme is the theme of capital intensity. The more machinery, the more kit, the more amazing computing technology, digital technology, that sort of stuff that you've got in your business, that will tend to make you more productive. And because New Zealand firms are quite small and often domestically focused, it's just easier for them to employ somebody than to invest in a machine. So that's about building scale once again. The more we can build export scale, the more we can build international scale, the more likely it is that those businesses will invest not only in new people with higher skills, but also in new machinery, new capital, plant and equipment. Very important. It's a story that a lot of New Zealand firms, if you walk into their factories, you'll find they're working with 20 or 30-year-old pieces of equipment because they can't afford to upgrade it. So that's a real challenge for us. Next point, and I know Anna's going to talk about this in a minute or two, and it's a particularly important point for small business, is digital capability. We've still got lots and lots of small businesses in New Zealand, even if they are domestically focused, being far less productive than they otherwise might be because they don't have digital capability. When I started my business, IronDuke, 4.5 years ago, we immediately put everything in the cloud. Yes, we went straight to Xero, day one, and everything else, and Dropbox and all that rest of the stuff. And I was amazed at how easy it was to do that and how much we could focus on doing the things we needed to do as a business rather than worrying about fixing computers and stuff. So that's a really important part for small business, not just them, but particularly them. It'll build their productivity, and I certainly commend the ideas that Xero has around that. And the last one I'll raise with you, which is one of those other big issues before I stop, is R&D intensity, research and development intensity. Now, in New Zealand, people think R&D, it kind of rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? R&D as if it's one thing. It's not. That's all the way from big capital research, which is like NASA putting human beings on the moon. That's at one end of it. And the D end, development, can often be just changing a product around because of a warranty claim. They're all very good ways of building productivity. And I've always argued that in New Zealand, our strength is what I call big D, small r. We're really good at taking ideas from offshore. That's where the R happens. And we make them fit for purpose for New Zealand conditions. If you go into a sawmill, you'll see a lot of this where they've used overseas equipment to build capability to saw Pinus radiata, for example. That's a classic of a New Zealand growth story. We don't do enough of it. Once again, in the budget, I thought the right decisions were made about R&D grants, because R&D tax credits won't work so well in the next few years because a lot of people won't be paying much tax. So the idea of keeping the foot on the pedal around R&D and getting companies to invest in R&D is really important. I'd argue that there's one big missing link, and that is that business people in New Zealand have a poor history of talking to scientists in New Zealand. and scientists back the other way. It's a problem of the Five Eyes economies, other than the UK, where actually the US does it pretty well too, but a lot of countries like us don't do it very well. So we need to break through that. We need to get scientists and business people talking better together with some support from government, and hopefully that will build some productivity as well. I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Phil. I find it interesting, yeah, you mentioned the sort of free trade agreement and things of that nature, and we spoke to the UK government last year to try and ensure that actually when we're having free trade agreements in the discussions, and some of the negotiations are ongoing because they were keen to have the UK, New Zealand post-Brexit free trade agreement as the gold standard. So we've been trying to speak to them about making sure that services and solutions actually are very much the part of that and not just manufactured goods. And I know Anna will talk about it, but the whole digital literacy, you know, pre-COVID to some extent, we were talking about financial literacy, but now we're in obviously more of a digital world. Actually, we're in the same situation where we've got digital literacy. But just before I hand over to Anna, we've got a question for you. It's actually someone that knows you. As an employment lawyer that worked with PGT on the 4-day week, our current labour laws are still focused on payment for hours worked and time spent rather than outputs. What would you advise businesses to do to engage with government to persuade them to change the legislative settings?
Yeah, I agree with that. And hello, Gillian. I think that's absolutely right. We've got a set of labour laws in New Zealand that were basically drafted in the 60s. And I started out my career in employment, and I still deal a lot with unions globally, as others will know. So the problem we've got is a whole bunch of things like the Holidays Act and other employment law tend to think we work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. We're still kind of crafted like that. So we just need to get rid of that. We need to have adequate protections for workers. I'm not suggesting we reduce protections for workers, by no means, but we need to have a flexibility to allow workers and employers and unions to get together to say, look, the law's not going to get in the way of us being creative about the way in which we work. In fact, the law will be as protective of both workers and employers as it would be under the current situation. So this one, once again, with the Prime Minister talking about 4-day weeks and flexibility, and with this COVID crisis, I think now is a good time for CTU, Business New Zealand, PSA, maybe Aaron, to get together to say what would it take for us to kind of provide protection, but also provide the right kind of framework for us to have conversations about flexibility in the workplace.
Yeah, totally agree. So we've also got a number of polls during the session. And I think what I would like to do now, actually, just before we move to our next speaker, is actually if we can get our first poll up, and we'll get some, we'll gauge actually a response from the audience. So I wonder if Melanie, if you're there, if you're able to share that actually with us there, and it should be in front of your screen. So the question is, what level of productivity has your workforce achieved during lockdown? And if you can submit your answers, and then we'll come back and we'll be interested to see actually the level of response. I think actually for some organizations that have been well positioned here. So I'm going to be very optimistic and I'm going to go higher. It's a little bit like that program back in the UK, higher or lower. So it'll be interesting to see the answer. So while you're completing that, what I'd like to do now, thank you, Phil, really, really good insights. And there's a couple more questions there, but I think actually I'll position them possibly with one of the speakers. But Anna, if I'm able to invite you to give your presentation, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure, thank you, James, and kia ora, everyone. I'm absolutely thrilled today to be able to contribute to this productivity conversation because, you know, as a member of the New Zealand business community, I think we really do have a unique opportunity to think very intentionally about our biggest economic and also our biggest social problems as part of our way forward with COVID. It really is a burn the ships moment, I think, for all of us. It's a moment where we say, do we have a moment of free will where we think we can redesign the future that we want and desire, or will we just retreat back to the way we worked in the past? And I believe that now more than ever, it's time to build. For those of you who may have read Mark Andreessen's excellent article, if you haven't, I'd suggest you go and hunt it down. It really has got a lot of people thinking about, you know, what are the things that we neglected in the past and where do we need to invest in the future? And I think when we reflect on that, you know, for New Zealand, it's, well, what should we build? And it's probably no surprise that from my perspective, it's about technology and technology-enabled people. And I think there are a lot of consistent streams coming through from Philip and also from Murray. Murray talked about, you know, there's a question of what sector should we prioritise. And his response, I think, Murray, it was around, well, you need to create an environment where firms can innovate and grow. And so I think we need to look at those ubiquitous things that we can, the gifts that we can give our people and our small businesses to do just that. So I know from my conversations with small businesses, and I've had many over the last few months, that they're doing it really tough at the moment, without a doubt. We all know that. That sentiment is echoed right through the media, through our politicians and commentators. And really, if we think about our economic train, if you like, that for whatever reason, because the inputs was charging along in the past, is really ground to a halt because of COVID-19. But I want us to think about it in a different way. The train hasn't really stopped. It's just jump tracks or jump curves, if you like, as we like to say in technology. We still have some forward momentum, but to get back up to speed, we really need to build the infrastructure that's ahead of us, and we need to do that really, really quickly. So my big bet on New Zealand's future is that if we become the most digitally enabled nation, we'll become the most productive nation. It's about that gift of ubiquitous tools, both through education, but also through kit, through technology and infrastructure that we can give, that will enable us to really come out of this faster and stronger. So I think through leveraging automation and technology will really put us on the fast track for productivity. And there's two really big areas of investment we need to focus on to get there. Firstly, as I've talked about, it's about infrastructure, getting our 5G network nailed, etc. But secondly, it's in digital retraining. So our workforce and the next generation of Kiwis are prepared for the inevitable impact of automation on employment. And we knew this was coming. We knew automation was coming. It's come faster because of COVID, and now we have a choice about what we want to do with that. So we need to get Kiwis into a position, into an occupation, a career where they can contribute to building this new future. And of course, as we know at Xero, technology is only as good as the human behind it. And we can't be passengers in this process, on this train, if you like. We want to be the designers and the engineers that are building this train. So the broader that we can expose our people to technology and automation through enablement and training, the more beautiful and high speed and efficient this amazing new economic engine is going to be for us. On the flip side, you know, what could we do? We could do nothing, or build with insufficient urgency. And what happens? We run out of tracks and the rest is history. So what could form part of the solution and what's already underway? And I think when I look back at the budget that was presented, I saw what I hope, and we've talked about this from a Xero perspective a lot in the media this week, but it's just the beginnings of a much more substantial and longer term commitment to helping small businesses. And in particular, as Philip talked about, to really navigate and leverage the wave of technology and automation that is coming, ready or not, for us. The budget includes funds to provide incentives and grants and encourage e-commerce and training more digital advisors. And that's a really good step in the right direction. But I can't help but think we just need to think much bigger, much more ambitious than that, than just e-invoicing and e-commerce grants. So obviously working smarter is one of those keys to unleashing business potential. And as we've talked about, you know, at Xero, we were using Google for many years, but for a lot of other businesses, they've realized the benefit of Zoom. For a lot of businesses that were operating on premise, they've suddenly had to pivot into e-commerce and omni-channel inventory channels and solutions. And those things, those cloud technologies are a huge part of that. If you just think about the difference of a dairy farmer who's able to reconcile bank transactions, track their business performance in real time, collaborate with their advisor, the profitability of a builder who can accurately track and quote the time and cost of a job from a mobile app, who can invoice before they leave the job and start to look at the profitability of the next job before they're on site. All this stuff is hugely important to every sector of our community. And last year at Xero, we commissioned some research actually with NZIER to look at the potential of cloud-based business technology, because we were seeing so much evidence of this within our own business community, but we wanted to look at it on a more global scale. And the research, of course, was conducted pre-COVID, but I think the findings are super relevant. What it found was a 20% uptake in cloud-based technology could increase GDP by up to 2.1% and add $6.2 billion to the New Zealand economy annually. And last year, through the Prime Minister's Business Advisory Council, which I sat on, we also commissioned a report called A Future That Works to identify how we could leverage technology and automation to boost productivity. And we laid out recommendations to the government, like things like SME in a box, to encourage and recommend app and technology through the use of loans and grants and investment. So at Xero, we're asking government for a very bold policy on this, similar to Singapore. And Philip, you talked about the fact that OECD has said skilled economies do well. And that is no happy coincidence. Singapore has invested for a very long time in a digital program for their SMEs called Go Digital. And we're asking for a capped amount, a 70% grant, to help our small businesses in adopting a range of cloud-based business solutions. So how can we help with this? We think that, you know, when we look at the future ahead of us, and again, what we saw was that by 2030, when we looked at our research through the Business Advisory Council, 1 in 3 adult workers by 2030 would need to reskill and change their occupation. Now with COVID, that's accelerated even further, of course. So I think when we think about it, this wave of opportunity, and I'd like us to look at it that way, will involve complex interactions and judgment. And it's good news for us because I think that we're disproportionately a country of thinkers, of inventors, of pioneers. And when we think about weightless exports, and Xero is one of those, there's very few limiting factors in our ability to export our knowledge and software. And I think, you know, the fact that geographical distance is limiting, let's challenge that. Let's think about the other weightless exports that we could look at as part of the New Zealand economy. So again, if we think about the budget, pleasing to see the investment in free trades training, but every month we don't invest in training to upskill our workforces, another month we fall behind. And again, as part of the New Zealand Business Advisory Council, we also recommended a national digital certificate as a scalable way for businesses to retrain employees in technology skills that will be needed for a lot of the future roles. And I think, Philip, you talked about that micro-credentialing. And again, if people have been laid off, if they've been made redundant, how do we pivot them into retraining right now and make that use of time really productive and useful? Just before I end, I just wanted us to reflect on, you know, when we talk about productivity, it is for everyone, not just those that are employed or have access to training. So when we think about this wave and this opportunity of automation as the great equalizer, we need to make sure that what it doesn't lead to is widening existing poverty and gender gaps. And I think, you know, we think about this utopian future, but if you just reflect on the last few months, working from home isn't, you know, the best thing for everyone. So if I think about maybe a mum with 6 kids at home and it's super, super hard, how do we support her to retrain and to work from home? We know that there's a direct correlation too between access to the internet in households and increase in household income. So how do we make sure that we're designing a future where everyone gets access to that? And if we think about what is at our disposal, you start to think about even, you know, your local libraries and how we could start to repurpose those into learning centres with 5G, with devices, with study nooks, with areas where you can work remotely to get that flexibility. So I think that is the promise and the gift of technology, but it will require a really coherent, collaborative national approach, a bold and ambitious approach that ensures everyone is future ready and we're not leaving anyone behind. And at Xero, just to leave you with one thought, we often talk about doing the best work of our lives. And as a nation, if we step back and looked at that, what would that look like if we were bold enough to think about putting a stake in the ground and say, gosh, you know, by year X, we want to be the most digitally enabled nation in the world. You know, how do we get there? Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Some really interesting points. I've just made some notes here. You mentioned Singapore, and it was interesting actually, sort of, I think it was about 18 months ago, the PM actually gave an address at the Singapore FinTech Festival, and I sort of half called her out a little bit because I actually thought it would have been a really, really good opportunity to actually use that as a little bit of as a campaign to actually put our technical capabilities actually firmly on the map. Because when we've led delegations up there, it's almost like technology in New Zealand, really? Come on, surely it's all about beef and sheep and everything else. So we do have to do, I think, a collective job or a better job in actually in telling the story. Obviously, you guys do it tremendously well all over the world, and obviously we need to keep that going. But you also mentioned there, in terms of education and retraining, I think we're in a fantastic opportunity in terms of what we've been presented with. It's whether we're actually prepared for it or not. Because imagine actually if you are a person that unfortunately does lose your job through this particular situation, having the ability to learn through micro-credentials or whatever it may be, you know, you've been in business, you've held various positions in different sectors, you know, you're a valuable commodity that actually we could pivot into our technology sector, our SaaS businesses and so forth. So I think it's almost a duty of care of whether we can come together to actually to do that. And, you know, with people like yourself leading the way, I think, you know, we definitely can do that. Before I jump to Jarrod, so thank you very much for those insights. Before I jump to Jarrod, I just want to give us the results of our poll. So to remind you of the question, what level of productivity has your workforce achieved during lockdown? Now, everybody's obviously at the edge of their seats waiting for the news. I can, however, say it was quite close, but 34% basically said about the same, and then we had 28% saying higher. So that was quite interesting. 9% much higher, 8% not in position to answer, 7% much lower, 14% lower. So, you know, about the same, higher. So what does that actually tell us? So now what I'd like to do is introduce Jarrod to the floor to go through his presentation. Jarrod, over to you. Thank you.
Kia ora, everybody. Ko tainui te waka, ko Ngāti Maniapoto me Ngāti Mahuta ngā iwi. So I'm Jarrod Haar. I'm a professor of human resource management. And because I'm a professor, I have a slideshow. I'm sorry for those of you who have been like PowerPointed to death. I only have a few slides. Melanie, can we jump up there and get to the second slide? The first one just says the presentation name. So my interest, because of this topic, was about people working from home, and were they productive or were they distracted, and therefore we didn't get much productivity out of everybody. So I'm lucky. At AUT, we were sent the mandate of, you know, go forth and be an academic and do and keep working. So the organizational psychologist side of me, if we ask workers how good they are, we hit this 90-10 rule. 90% of workers say they're in the top 10% of productivity. Yes, I'm an excellent worker, says almost everybody. And in the end, we actually get no usefulness out of those kind of questions. So when it comes to employee surveys, we never ask people how productive are you in your job, or how good you are in your job, because most of the time we don't get quality data. So what I did for this, and can we get the next slide there, Mel, please? So what I did is I said, think about your productivity in the last week. And we started off with the same, and did it go up higher or did it go down lower? And what I tried to capture here is, now this is just a snapshot out of 1,026 New Zealand employees across
a whole level of professions and industries and sectors. And I thought, well, this would give us some kind of information which we don't really know. Clearly, there are some people working at home with children, and they were doing, you know, online schooling in the mornings and then trying to do their jobs in the afternoon. So we clearly knew it wouldn't be all up the higher end, for example, but a lot of organizations in New Zealand have said, oh, I can't send my workforce or allow them to work from home because they'll all watch Netflix all day and never do any work. So can we have the results there, Mel, please? So the overall score here is, so 0 is everybody is the same. And the average, the mean score there is just 0.75. So we're all on average across this 1,000 people, people said their productivity remained pretty much the same during the lockdown. You can see, as we perhaps would expect, a bit of a widespread there. Some clearly weren't that productive, and some clearly were more productive by being at home. And the second question I asked, and I don't have that graphically for you, but it is fairly similar, it was around how much effort they had to put in to be as productive. And that ended up averaging out about 3% positive. So people had to work a little bit harder. And if you think about the context of the lockdown, if you're like myself, I'm still locked down at home. Universities, we're not even allowed back to our workplaces. I don't know when. I don't know when I'm going to be released. I used to be a big fan of working from home, and now I can't wait to escape the home to get to the workplace. Mel, can I have the next slide, please? So I knew this audience would be interested. So what drives productivity? So one of the things, the very first one, I just want to have a shout out there to managing directors, CEOs. 21% of respondents said, I haven't heard from my CEO in the last couple of weeks. So there's the first thing we should be aware of. Those that didn't hear from their CEO were less productive and put in less effort. And that is statistically significant. So just a little take home here is, if in your workplace you think actually our CEO hasn't touched base with everybody, notice that I said irrespective of message. It doesn't matter what the CEO was saying, just whether they've touched base and obviously said, hi everybody, I hope you're doing all right. So leadership has an indirect effect. It's not a direct driver of productivity. The top 2 factors there, so I had a lot of factors, and I'm not going to bore you with all of those. Work effort and happiness were the 2 key ones for productivity. If you're workers who are happy, were more productive, and obviously the harder they worked, the more productive they were. Job satisfaction and work-life balance were key, but tended to work more through a satisfied worker with better work-life balance was happier, and they were more productive. So ironically, when I looked at the data, I expected, I do a lot of work-family research, and I thought perhaps people would be struggling a lot with work pressures at home. Less of a problem. It is worth noting though, because so this is data from a week ago, just finished. I have data from just before the break, before the lockdown, and things like happiness have decreased slightly. They're down about 5 percentage points, while things like job stress have also decreased, interestingly enough, over this lockdown period, because we've got less pressures, ironically, about the job, perhaps a bit more understanding from the bosses. My last couple of points there, working from home, 40% of respondents didn't want it. So these are clearly two groups of people, those whose jobs require them to be at work, or they have greater access to materials to be productive. So not everybody wants it, but even those who you might think could work from home aren't always going to like to work from home. 30%, about 300 of respondents were managers, and I asked them, do you want to manage your workforce working from home, and you can see there 42% of those managers said, no, I don't want to manage them from home. I did ask them why, and a lot of those factors were around what's the complexity of, I want to keep an eye on my workers. Some were saying I've got a problematic team and I do need to see them more often in person rather than electronically. And interestingly there, because I had the data, 65% of managers don't want to work from home themselves. But it's worth noting, obviously, the flip side there, about 60% of employees would like to work from home. 35% of managers think, yes, I could actually be more productive working from home. So that's just a little snapshot of our New Zealand workforce. It's roughly even by gender. As I said before, it's across the private sector, the public sector, and the not-for-profit sector. It's about 1,000 employees. So, were we productive or distracted over the lockdown? My answer is it's probably was somewhat surprisingly at least as productive as normal, might be on average. There will clearly be some better performers than not. Going forward, working from home is clearly a way that organizations might be able to save building costs, for example. And we've just seen an IRD thing this morning coming out around, I think it's a $15 a week amount you can claim if you're working from home. So we're even seeing things like the IRD changing their systems as well. So that's just a quick snapshot from me. James, you must have a question.
Thanks, Jarrod. Really, really insightful statistics. I mean, I've just written down a couple of points there. I mean, you said 21% of people hadn't heard from the CEO, and obviously the impact around that. So was there any specific comments made around the sort of, you've got the statistics around communication, and was it communication was coming out from the CEO, but it wasn't filtering down through the various channels, or was it there was just no communication?
Yeah, so on that one, it was no communication at all. Hadn't heard a single thing. Okay. So one thing I was doing on that data was actually looking at crisis leadership to see. Now, what I found was the crisis leadership didn't actually have much effect, had no effect directly on productivity, but it did have an effect on things like mental health and happiness. So a happy worker is a productive worker, yes. One of the ways we keep the workforce happy is by having good leadership around things like communication, making decisions, acknowledging when they've made the wrong decision, and then changing tack, things like that.
Yeah, and it is interesting, the concept, this concept of the health and well-being of the employee, and obviously the productivity that actually leads to, and it's something I think that we are addressing, but I think there's definitely some more that we can do. So thank you for those insights. So what I'd like to do now, Melanie, if we'd like to jump to our next poll. So just as that's coming up on our screens, so the second poll will be, do you think productivity is an issue for New Zealand? And there'll be a couple of answers coming up on your screen now. Strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, or strongly disagree. If we can have your answers now, that would be great. Excellent. So we're trucking along. So what I'd like to do now is invite Charlotte, the CEO of the 4-Day Global Week, to give us her insights into what you've seen through your pilot, but also in your travels around the world, and possibly some indicators around the media frenzy of today. You're just on mute.
Oh, there we go.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, James. Yes, it's a very interesting thing. So Andrew and I decided to put together this webinar because when we travel around the world, pretty much the common issue is around productivity. And New Zealand has its own productivity issues, and as Murray and Philip have given us good insight into, there are unique issues for New Zealand, and we are not ahead of the game. And so what we wanted to do is share how the 4-day week actually enhances productivity. So just to be clear about where we came in, we ran a 4-day week in our business in Perpetual Guardian because Andrew read an article about how low productivity was in Canada and the UK, and wondered whether that was the case in our business. And so our journey down the whole 4-day weeks space was to answer that question within our own business. And so as I travel around the world and I talk to people about this, and I've talked to a lot of people, post-COVID as well, how do I even measure productivity? So tip number one is actually, we just asked our staff. Andrew challenged the staff to help us with that. And so the other thing that we see as we travel around the world is that business leaders don't trust their staff. They're fearful about being measured on things that they don't know how to control. And they really, when they don't know how to really properly measure their productivity, they just don't trust to send their staff home. Now, COVID has forced it on us and it's required us to go home. And so we've jumped over the trust issue straight into I have to find a way to make this work. And so we've had to have this combination of remote working and flexible working. And I think that, back to some of the survey results, I think it's entirely ironic that the people in the workforce who really wanted the 4-day week and flexible working, remote working, of course, have been the parents, and we've sent them home to work and we've given them the children to homeschool at the same time. And I think that actually when we're talking about remote and flexible working in the workplace, we're not talking about doing it with the kids around. So obviously here in New Zealand, we have had a chance to send our children back to school. And so parents have had that chance to actually do remote working from home, assuming of course that they are still working from home. And so as dreadful as COVID is, and there is no denying that we're going to go through some really horrid times, this is quite an exciting time for the future of work. And it's an exciting time for us here in New Zealand, because if we can solve the productivity issue, we can really create a huge advantage for us. We talk about the frontier firms mattering and how we create the digital space that Anna was talking about, and how do we encourage our minds, that all of our inventiveness, all the entrepreneurs, all the very clever people here in New Zealand to develop businesses and develop frontier firms and pay well and do all of that sort of stuff. And how do we educate our population more? And obviously, if you work less hours, you have time for educating yourself. Now, obviously, if you've been made redundant, then you've got a lot more time. But we want people to continue to be working. And so, but what we don't want to do is part of the problem that we see in Ireland, for example, is they have an incredibly educated population, but they're effectively an overqualified call center for the US. And so I think we want to be in a very different space, where we're creating that innovation, we're creating more Xeros that can take New Zealand out into the real world. And so how do we, get that balance right? Because obviously there are going to be businesses that can't at the moment afford to pay their staff full-time wages. We're seeing this more and more, and it's quite common overseas, and I'm sure it's happening here. Maybe Erin might have a better understanding of what that is in New Zealand. But if we have a process where we can't afford to keep our people working full-time, then we need to be very clear as to what that journey is back to full-time pay. If we're changing contracts or we're swapping people down to less hours and less pay to try and maintain jobs and preserve employment, then what is our true conversation about getting back to full-time pay? We don't want to be the economy that takes that shift down. And they did that in Ireland again after the GFC. We need a pathway straight back up. And what we think might be a great idea is that actually, if we are in a situation where employers need to drop wages, is whether that wage subsidy that we've become very useful can actually fill that gap and actually jump in and make sure people are being kept on the higher income, but that they use that time to engage with education, to engage with digital upskilling, to engage with something that makes business more profitable, which makes the economy more profitable. And if businesses are having the benefit of that wage subsidy going into them, then what is the journey for those businesses to be making themselves and focusing in on their productivity? For made a comment when he was speaking to Simon Bridges' committee around the fact that you can't tell business what to do, you have to ask them what they need. And so we've got to take that on. And when business doesn't really know what productivity is, then we've got to help them understand what that is. And then we've got to help them understand how to improve it. And those improvements can't be dictated. They need to be things that we bring along with what we do. So I think that it's a really interesting time to be in. We need to be clear about what the future of work is, because it's here and it's now. If we don't have a good pathway, we are just going to go back to our old habits, but our old habits won't move us forward. In fact, they're likely to leave us further behind. Everyone is scrambling on this. So interestingly, the media articles today with Jacinda, and she was obviously relating it to how it might benefit domestic tourism. Everyone around the world is suffering from the same problem. And we've had quite a lot of media connect into us from around the world today, and they're all wanting those same answers. And so if we can fix those for ourselves, we need to make sure that we're on top of it, because everyone else is looking to fix it too. And we don't want to be left behind. We're at this wonderful country at the end of the world, but we can lead the world in how we drive this forward. So I challenge you all to think about, what is productivity for you and in your workplace? What are your solutions around what that might look like? Over to you, James.
Thank you, Charlotte. Some really great insights, and there's a couple of questions, as I'm sure you would have expected, come through. So yeah, just the first one actually. Is there any legislative or contractual hurdles that you faced in implementing this 4-day week in your business?
No, we didn't actually. So we got around that by actually not changing our employment contracts at all. It's not a get around. Our staff are actually still hired to work 5 days a week. We give them a day off, and they opt into a program which has certain conditions around what they do. And one of the participants on the call is Gillian Service, and she was from Mintalis and part of the legal advice. And on our 4-day week website is our legal advice, and is also our opt-in contract. So if you're looking to do something like this, that information is available. But as we go into post-COVID, we might actually all need to be looking at what is the change to our employment contracts, and we need to be very careful that we do things that protect our worker rights, that create a business model that we can sustain, but don't result in us using people in the wrong way. The gig economy is huge for doing that, creating an environment where, people don't have any rights, and all of the responsibilities that businesses sitting around redundancies and sick pay, holiday pay, they're all just being handed over to the people, and that's not right.
And just a couple of questions before we come to you, Erin. So does, the flexibility of obviously the 4-day week, does that just mean that people are working more hours in less days? No, so we firmly advocate for reduced hours working. So we are talking about a program which we call our 100-80-100 principle. So you work 100%, we pay you 100%, you work 80% of hours, and you provide 100% of the output or the outcomes that you were asked to do. Now that can apply whether you're working 1 day, 2 days, 5 days, or even if you're working too much. So, we know there's a certain company not too far away, their average hours are 53. Well, getting down to, for example, a 32-hour work week, big ask. But what if we could just, ease that down to 50, ease that down to 40? So actually 100-80-100 is really good for reducing work. And just lastly, it works across any sector? Yes, there are around the world. There are banks, there are farms, there are manufacturing, there are law firms, there are schools. You name it. There are firms doing 4-day week. If you think it's too hard for your business, then just decide how imaginative you are. If we are not reimagining the world as it will need to be, we're just re-engineering the past. Excellent. Thank you, Charlotte. Really, really useful insights. And I think, as Charlotte said, it's From a leadership point of view, get out of the way, let the teams, the employees come up with the solutions, and it really will have a great impact on your business. So very patiently waiting, and thank you, Erin. I'd like to now hand over to you to give your presentation. Thank you.
E mihi kia koe, James. Thanks to our hosts, and I want to acknowledge the other panelists. I've really enjoyed this wait, actually, because the content's been amazing. And e mihi kia koutou, those of you who are joining in from home or from your offices to watch this. My name's Erin Polachuk. I co-lead the PSA, which is New Zealand's largest union. As James mentioned, that's a union of over 76,000 members currently, and you'll probably know that we're a public sector union, but we also have members who work in the community public sector, that is a contracted out sector, in the local government sector and the DHBs as well. So we have quite a range within our membership. I'm going to ask, first of all, what are the barriers to improved productivity in our workplaces? And we would argue that a lack of worker participation contributes significantly to missing out on productivity gains. I was really happy to hear about Jarrod's survey. We recently surveyed our members about their experience of working from home during the lockdown period. And unfortunately, we hadn't crunched the data before this webinar. But I was interested to see the question about what stood in the way of productivity, and that seems to relate to a lack of support from the employer, lack of communication, so kind of workplace culture issues. And so when we've crunched that data, I'm going to share it with Jarrod, because I think we're going to find some commonality in that. So I would argue that productivity is improved through genuine, consistent, regular and sustainable participation of workers in decision making. Why is increased participation linked to increased productivity? So some of you may know about Eurofound. They're an incredible specialised research agency of the EU based in Ireland. And they ran a study across European countries on productivity and found that where there is more worker involvement, there is increased productivity. And interestingly, where there's increased worker involvement, there's also increased worker well-being. So well-being and productivity being higher, two sides of the same coin. So why is this? It's because workers bring with them into their role knowledge and experience and ideas and social and cultural skills, and they share this information with the business or organisation where they work, where those experiences are heard and valued and where those skills have been recognised. And worker involvement in decision making enhances communication among workers as well as between workers and their HR, which enhances motivation, and worker participation improves the overall culture and level of engagement within businesses and within organisations. So, I mean, but it sort of makes sense, doesn't it? Because everybody feels good when they're asked for their opinions and asked to be part of a solution. There's a positive impact on well-being. PSA has long voiced its opposition to workplace cultures, which we say can be about command and control in New Zealand. And we've opposed unitarist HR models. And you'll hear us often talking about high performance, high engagement ways of working. That's what we promote. And we are always seeking engagement opportunities through our elected delegates with employers. We promote high trust models of working, which treat workers as responsible adults with ideas and expertise to contribute. Involving workers also improves mental and physical health and reduces time off due to sickness. So there's a productivity dividend there. We promote, as well as high trust work environments, good dignified working conditions. And this includes workers having a say over the time that they spend at work, but also the ways in which they spend their time. And I just want to mention briefly a related piece of work we've been involved in called the Gender Pay Principles. We agreed those on a tripartite way with agencies and the State Services Commission. And they establish, among other things, flexible work by default in the public service. So no matter what your home situation is, I'm sure all of us have something else which is occupying our time and which we want to balance work with. And the idea that a worker should be confined where there's no reason to conducting work between, say, 8 and 5 is just old-fashioned and actually increasingly unnecessary. By the way, with the gender pay principles work, we achieved that in that tripartite discussion and through collective agreements. We haven't found any constraint from the ERA to making that happen, which is, and it has been really positive for a lot of our members. Since Charlotte was just discussing a reduction of working time, I just want to say we need to consider that in the context of a work environment where interpersonal and collective relationships don't suffer, because the relationships in the workplace are really important to productivity too. And I also stress that we shouldn't focus, when we talk about productivity, on indicators which are just about technical outputs, because the quality of relationships and the quality of outputs is also important. Bill Rosenberg was the CTU economist. He's recently retired, and he, last time I saw him present at a conference, he talked about labour share and productivity, and I thought I'd just share one element of that presentation. He outlined that since 1989 in New Zealand, worker wages have actually fallen behind productivity growth. And so the growth of productivity hasn't translated to a similar rate of wage growth over that period of time, and that gap was widening in the presentation he gave. It's not fair to continue to expect that increasing productivity from a workforce while reducing their share of reward. So I think that's kind of in line with what Charlotte was saying. We can have increased productivity without having a decrease to wages and to conditions of work. So, I mean, you won't be surprised to hear me say this, because hours of work has been a core theme for unions for many, many years, before I was even born. Since the Industrial Revolution, in fact, and New Zealand has a claim to fame to be the first country in the world to establish the 8-hour working day. So that the whole idea of that was that the worker, who was then a man, was to have a well-rounded life and to support his wife and kids to work for 8 hours a day. And in that same family unit today, we would potentially have 2 times that amount of work being put out there into the labour force. So a family has arguably doubled productivity in that maybe the man and the woman in a heterosexual relationship would work, and outsourced some of that unpaid work that would have been done in a family unit. And that's, anyway, that's a big topic of its own. But what our members are telling us is that their working hours are growing, and with it work intensification, and that's having an impact on them in terms of burnout and stress and mental health issues, but also it impacts on families as well. So there are so many reasons why we should go for a shorter working week. My list is very long. I probably don't have time, but I'm going to pick a few. Gender equality is close to my heart. With a shorter working week, both genders can participate equally in unpaid work in our society. We can avoid stress, burnout, and we can promote well-being. We can enhance the creation of employment and the redistribution of employment. So every 3 years, PSA, along with the University of Victoria University, do a workplace dynamics survey. And what we show through that is the many, many hours of unpaid overtime or free work that PSA members do. But we also have those within our membership who are struggling to meet minimum guaranteed hours. And so what we're finding is that work, even within our membership, isn't evenly distributed. There's also a sustainability angle, another issue close to my heart. When people have more time outside of work, they have time to do things like walk to work maybe, or do fewer commutes, or create homemade food rather than go for energy, ready-made and, not very healthy food. And time for people to exercise, or to exercise their creativity or the other things that make a person, feel good about themselves. And better communities and societies overall, happier, healthier, and more equal places to live. I also think it's worth mentioning that when work hours are reduced, we'll have an increase in democratic participation, which is incredibly important in a democracy, and because people will have time to participate. We argue that reducing working time does not cost. At the moment, workers are covering the cost of long hours and work intensification through the impact on their health and their families. and the toll that takes on their out-of-work commitments and responsibilities. And arguably also the state picks up some of the costs too, in terms of picking up the impact of poor worker physical and mental health. The working time reduction can also be financed by increases in productivity through worker participation, which is what I started off by talking about. And also if more people are employed, so if working time was better distributed, then there are more taxes being paid, which also increases production and consumption within the overall economy and increases state investment and so on. We know of a lot of examples where unions internationally have negotiated around working time. And so I might talk about a few of those, just stressing that I don't think this can work without union and worker involvement in creating the solution. We want working time reduction of flexible working schemes not to disadvantage workers, and we also want it not to impact on service users, because of course many of our members work in service. Also importantly, and this was mentioned by Charlotte too, it can't violate employment rights, and I've said this, negotiations must include the union. So some concrete examples, which I might not have time to get into too much, include the Metal Workers Union in Germany, which covers all of the automobile industry, and they've negotiated a 35-hour working week. They have quite a complex arrangement actually, where a percentage can choose to work full-time, and the union gets all of the information and gets to ensure it's implemented properly. And then you can opt for a 28-hour working week for 2 years with the right to go back to your full-time arrangement after that. And there seems to be negligible impact on pay. So there's been quite creative ways around that negotiated packages are distributed in a way where those on lower incomes get more of the package, and interesting ideas to kind of lessen inequality within that workforce, which we find quite inspiring. We've also got a lot of examples of work time accounts, and this is where some employers have tried to use this to regulate in an industry where there's kind of seasonal work or fluctuations in the number of work hours needed. So you can kind of have credit or deficits depending on how much work that you're doing, and you have a compensation period in which you need to use that that time that you've accrued up. And in Germany, these are regulated through kind of fair pay agreements and also at company level. But crucially, works councils or the unions are involved in setting up those processes and in managing those as well. And in working time accounts, some ideas that you might be more familiar with are kind of short-term accounts, which is, you know, adjusting the working time of employees to varying production, and so that you can build up, you can, sorry, I've lost my place. I'm going to move to long-term accounts, working time accounts, which is something actually the academics will be familiar with, which is accumulating hours of work for a specific purpose, like a sabbatical. And this is something that we've worked with as well, and that long-term accounts are designed to offer employees long-term time sovereignty during their working life without the loss of pay. But it's also relevant to this training issue, which has been raised by a number of the speakers on the panel today. So I rushed over those, but there's a range of international examples, and some of them quite complex. We're not advocating for any of those in particular, but I'm just saying that we're inspired by those, and we think that where there's engagement with the unions, we can get to some really creative ideas and solutions between workers and employers to meet any challenge that a recession or any future crises or this current crisis is going to bring into workplaces. So yeah, thanks again, James, for the opportunity to bring a worker perspective into this dialogue.
No, thank you. And I mean, yeah, I think, like you said, I mean, there's a lot of points in there, and I suppose I don't want to put you on the spot and get you bombarded. But you know, would people be able to sort of reach out, and maybe if there's some more information that they would sort of like, because it definitely sounds like there's a there's a deeper conversation that we can have. Unfortunately, today we just don't have the time. What I'd like to do, though, and thank you for that. You've seen the sort of the results of the second poll. Does New Zealand have a productivity issue? I think you can see by the results, most people, 44% agree, 42% strongly agree. So I think collectively on the call today, all the panelists, certainly with their insights, show that we need to focus on this. Thank you for obviously putting that up, Melanie. Now we've got a couple of questions just before I hand back to Charlotte that have come through, generally actually for everybody on the call. So I suppose this is quite an interesting one. A desire to increase productivity through more capital investment with the move towards a slower pace of life / less consumption that is necessary for environmental reasons. Regenerative agriculture requiring more labor but less output. What do we think about that? I mean, what do we think about more capital investment but the move towards a slower pace of life and less consumption? Feel free to, if anybody wants to just unmic and jump in and take a stab at that.
I don't think there's any dichotomy between those two things. You can just as easily set up smart technology to make much more highly sustainable products and services. A good example is a big investment in digital will enable people to work from home and to get away from inappropriate travel, for example. Usually speaking, inside New Zealand firms, if you look at the machinery inside them, it's actually often pretty old and therefore pretty carbon intensive and pretty clunky. So if you could get better machinery, it may well be that you can have a more sustainable outcome. Generally speaking, the newer the piece of physical equipment, the less carbon intensive it is. That's just a generality. So I don't see the two as in conflict. In fact, I see the idea of productivity as being a bonus in terms of well-being outcomes, because hopefully we'll be more prosperous as a nation and able to better pay for the kinds of outcomes that we seek.
Thanks, Phil. Another question, and maybe, sorry, Murray, did you want to jump in there as well? Sorry, I didn't know if you put your hand up to make it. Oh, you're on mute. Oh, sorry, Murray, just say that again.
Unmute.
He's still on mute. Go on, Murray. Oh, we're not getting Murray coming through.
High productivity industries tend to be ones with a high degree of capital intensity. And I was listening to Aaron with a great deal of interest. The example of the German automobile industry, highly capital intensive, high degree of automation, robot type of technology and so forth, which obviously gives opportunities for both higher pay and greater flexibility. And that's certainly to be welcomed. In terms of regenerative agriculture, absolutely. But there's been farmers for a long time looking and thinking about, do they reduce production and actually increase their margins that way and put less stress on soil and water and so forth? And more power to them is all I can say.
Thanks, Murray. And just one final question just before I hand back to Andrew and Charlotte, just to close what has been an absolutely amazing session. It's probably maybe more of an incentive. So the questions come through and it says, do New Zealand businesses lack the incentive to invest in productivity enhancing technology and modern equipment? And if so, how do we overcome that? And Anna, you obviously talked a little bit about that sort of earlier on. So I don't know, maybe you want to jump in there?
Sure. Look, I think it's really hard to reimagine what you can't see. And so I think a firm position and vision by government to be able to say, we believe, because we can see what's happening around the rest of the world and because of our unique aspects of being down the bottom of the world and having a lot of water around us, here's what we believe to be true in the future. And that is that we do need to level up and raise the tide of digital learning, but also investment in automation. And so we firmly believe that a program that's and a policy very similar to the Singaporean government and some Nordic countries, where they do provide investments and grants and incentives to invest in that automation and technology would be hugely beneficial, because you've got to remember investing is one thing, but then you've got to get through the change curve. And there was a question around, in the Q&A around that, in terms of, learning these new skills and being able to drive this train once we're on it. And so it's got to be a beautifully mapped out and design process, if you like, right from here's the investment, here's our vision, and here's how we might get there. And you do need the support of people really understanding the technology. You need cloud integrators to come in, and there's a question there again around, we're often a face-to-face company. How do we even start on this journey? So we need to think deeply about this, and like business does, create where we're at today, where do we want to be, and design that experience for our citizens and for our businesses to get there. So the short answer is yes, we do need incentives and we need a path forward.
Yeah, and it's, having worked in large complex organizations for nearly the last 2 decades, it is definitely one of those things that if you don't invest and continue to invest, unfortunately, it does come back to bite you. And certainly, I think that there is great technology actually out there built in New Zealand for New Zealand that we should be adopting to actually help drive more productivity. So just before I hand back to Charlotte and Andrew, I think we'll just go to our final poll, which will just be coming up on your screens now. So this is an interesting one. So businesses need to resolve productivity. How much do you think government needs to be involved? And if you can answer, we'll see what the results have to say. So look, thank you for all of the speakers. That's been an absolutely insightful and wonderful session. I've certainly learned a lot. I've made copious notes: higher productivity, tech exports, micro-credentials, education, geographical USP, cost saving, environmental. I mean, the list just goes on. So it sounds like we've got our work cut out, but for the final few words, I'd like to hand back to Charlotte and Andrew. Thanks, everybody.
So thank you very much for coming along. Our next webinar will be on the 18th of June, and then we will tackle the 4-day week or reduced hours working question. There's a whole pile of issues that came up in the Q&A, and as Erin pointed out, that it's infinite to talk about, and there's so many things that we need to consider in terms of how we rebuild the future of work and how we rebuild our society. So look out for details coming through on your email about that. There will be details about it on our website tomorrow, and yeah, we will look forward to catching all of you up. So I want to thank my fabulous panelists. It was wonderful to have you join us on this conversation, and we really appreciate you giving up some of your very precious time and adding into the productivity question or productivity gap, I don't know. And yeah, let's rebuild to New Zealand together. We are a team of 5 million people, and so I want to thank all of you attendees who came along today too. You are part of the team, and we can fix productivity here in New Zealand if we do it all together.